Assalamualaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the previous episode, we looked a little bit about female scholarship and to see how the scholarship balance between men and women has disappeared over the century, especially in recent times. We started off talking about Aisha radiallahu anha, and inshallah today we're going to think about the role of Aisha radiallahu anha and her amazing knowledge of hadiths and her teachings, look at some of the further women of the Sahaba and of the Tabi'een, and also to think about what should we do now. Aisha radiallahu anha, as we heard, she narrated over 2,000 hadiths. She was the most amazing scholar, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removed her having children and emptied her time and made her young when she got married to the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, so that she could achieve this high level of scholarship. Now, it's also important to remember that the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam actually encouraged the Sahaba, and us as well of course, to learn from Aisha radiallahu anha. And this was not restricted to women only. He said, learn a portion of your deen from this red-faced woman. Now, it's well known that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to refer to Aisha in these beautiful nicknames. He used to call her Aish, and also this red-faced woman, because she had quite a ruddy complexion, radiallahu anha. So, we can see by this that the wives of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we'll see that Aisha wasn't the only one, were scholars in Islam. Now, the students of theirs were not just women, they were men as well. And men would teach women, and women would teach men. And this modern notion that we seem to have developed, which is certainly a cultural notion, if you think about what we've learned about the pre-Islamic Arabia and the cultural way that women were portrayed as just sexualized objects who were just there to seduce men. This has almost come back into this, and it seems to be okay in some cultures and some schools of thought that a man is fine to teach women, but a woman is not okay to teach men. And I don't see that there is any logic in this, especially when the evidence from the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that his own wife is teaching men. Surely out of every woman, Aisha radiallahu anha, who was the most beloved to the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would not have done something that would displease him, and more than that, would never have done something that displeased Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, members of the Sahaba, they would come to Aisha radiallahu anha, and they would talk to her, they would discuss with her, they would debate with her, they would also take their advice from her. In fact, one of her students, Musa ibn Talha, said, I didn't see anyone more eloquent than Aisha, the wife of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They would also consult her. She had a very mathematical brain. My brain is not mathematical. I'm very much the linguistic side of things. You know, some people are really good at maths and science, and some people are really good at language. Some really clever people are good at both. Aisha radiallahu anha was very clever in mathematics, and she had memorized all the mathematics of the Islamic inheritance system. So this was like her area of expertise. Most scholars will have some area of expertise, and this was hers, or one of hers. And she would give advice to the Sahaba when they maybe would get confused or forget or not be sure about a matter of the jurisprudence of inheritance. And they would come to her. There was no shame in this. This was a perfectly normal thing for them to do. And, you know, some people would say, oh, well, you know, she was an old woman when this happened. Actually, no, this happened all the way through, right from after the death of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right until her death, 50 years later, she was teaching both men and women. She was involved in lots of different things. She actually even built a school and a place where orphans could be taught and made into scholars. How amazing was she, radiallahu anha. 88 great scholars were her students, both from the Sahabi and from the Tabi'een. And people in those days, because there was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no TV like we have now. We're lucky, subhanAllah, we can access great scholars very easily. Unfortunately, we can also access incorrect information as well. But at that time, the only way of accessing the great scholars was to actually physically travel and meet them and sit with them and learn from them over a period of time. And this is what happened with people who would visit Aisha radiallahu anha and these other scholars that we're going to talk about, that they would come and they would sit around her and they would learn from her. And the most beautiful way of doing this, something that we don't get on the internet, is that when you're learning from a scholar, whether it's a female or a male, if you're sitting with them, not only is it a much more personal experience because they can read your face, because very much part of teaching is reading somebody's face and seeing whether they understand or they don't understand what you're saying, but also they could ask her questions. They could confirm things. So I always recommend, brothers and sisters, when you're going to go and learn something, by all means use books, use the internet, use Facebook, all the rest of it, but try and go and sit with a scholar. Brothers, go and sit with female scholars. Sisters, go and sit with female and male scholars. It's so important for us to learn our deen in a balanced manner. And this is what the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was doing. And this is what the wives and the other sisters and brothers were doing after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Salama radiallahu anha was also a very amazing example of a very learned sister. Now, we've seen her story in other contexts, but in this context, after the death of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she would teach some Sahaba and the Tabi'een as well. She was also the one who gained or gave advice to the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And actually, she would give advice out as a matter of course. Atiyah also taught some Sahaba and Tabi'een, and they would come all the way from Basra to learn from her. Basra was a great centre of education after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the Islam was spreading and the da'wah was happening. Basra became one of the most revered and best institutes of learning. And this, of course, continues. In fact, subhanallah, if we look at some of the, we have the four main madahib, the four main schools of thought. We have, of course, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Hanafi, and Maliki. And if we look at those main schools of thought, also, some of their thought and some of their teachers were from sisters. The Nafisa, who was the granddaughter of Hassan radiallahu anhu, was actually one of the teachers of Imam Shafi'i and other great scholars. And if we look at Aisha bin Sa'd ibn Abi Waqas, she was one of the teachers of Imam Malik and others. So we can see that education wasn't segregated. Nowadays we see this great increase, and segregation is taken to a very, very extreme level. Subhanallah. We know that under certain conditions it is not okay for brothers and sisters to be mixing with non-mahrams together. We know this. But we have to put this in the context and try not to take it so that we are making sure that men and women are almost becoming enemies of one another through the segregation. We know even in the mosque of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was no sisters section per se. Asma radiallahu anha is known to have asked a man who was sitting beside her during one of the khutbahs of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She's asked the man, because she didn't hear what the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, she asked the man to repeat it. She was sitting next to a man in the mosque. This is a sister of the wife of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is she going to do something that's haram? Or is it that we are taking the issue of segregation to a different level? A level that is almost destroying the balance between men and women in Islam. It's destroying the voice of women. Another issue that we should discuss is the issue of the awrah. Let's have a look at the balance between this and the evidence that we've seen. Now, we've seen very clearly that the wives of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba and the Tabi'een didn't have a problem with learning from a sister, a man learning from a woman. They didn't have a problem with it. Now, we also know that there is never any contradiction between the Quran and the Hadiths. There can't be. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was what? He was the walking Quran. So if there is no contradiction between the Quran and the Hadith, and there is also no contradiction in the Sunnah, and the wives and the companions around the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were putting into action what he was teaching or forbidding what he was forbidding, they wouldn't have done this action if it wasn't okay. When we're talking about the awrah of the woman being the voice, this is so very true. A woman, and sisters, you know this, a woman can use her voice in different ways. A woman can use her voice in a normal tone, like I'm speaking to you now. She can use it to teach, she can use it to act, she can use it to seduce. This is what the awrah means. When you're talking about the awrah, it is the covering of the sexuality of the woman or of the man as well. But because a woman's voice can be made into something that is very attractive and alluring, women are warned not to use the voice in this way. It's not that they shouldn't speak at all, and it's not that they shouldn't speak in front of men. It's that they shouldn't speak in a certain way in front of men for fear of leading towards a zina. So, inshallah, I hope, brothers especially, if you're thinking, okay, what should I do now? Should I go and learn from a female scholar as well as from my sheikh at the masjid? Yes, of course you should. You need a balance. We all need a balance in our life. Don't stop learning from a man to go learn from a woman. Learn from both. So just like the Sahaba would learn from the men and from the women, then we should do the same, inshallah. So until the next episode, Assalamualaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.